Estate Communications Group. On behalf of the Real Estate Publishing Group and the Illinois Real Estate Journal, I'm pleased to welcome you here to the 11th Annual Commercial Real Estate Forecast Conference.
All right, well, let's get into our discussion a little bit. And as I mentioned, Chris, most people in the audience know you from your role at the Merchandise Mart. And the Merchandise Mart was actually developed in 1930 by the Marshall Field Company. Your grandfather, Joe Kennedy, purchased the Merchandise Mart in 1945. And today it remains the world's largest commercial building with 4.2 million square feet in it. Tell us a little bit more about that history, why your grandfather became interested in the Mart back in the 40s, and also your decision to sell the Mart and Apparel Center to Vornado back in 1998.
You know, the Field organization, before it was a massive retailer, was an enormous wholesaler. And they had hundreds of employees who would travel throughout the Midwest calling on small retail stores in small towns and hamlets throughout the country. And they had this idea that they could consolidate all of that in one location, have the customers come to them. That was the concept behind the creation of the Merchandise Mart. They were going to go into the first 6 floors and then have their competitors, in essence, forced by the market to open showrooms in the floors above. And that idea was conceived of in the midst of the Roaring 20s. The building didn't open until the start of the Great Depression. It lost money very quickly, and Field's organization started looking for other uses. So the government was expanding because of the response to the Great Depression and also preparation for World War II. The Field organization started taking in large government leases. The government, in essence, condemned much of the space in the Mart so that they could expand there. And the building, in that condition began to fail economically. My grandfather had been the ambassador to England. He believed that after World War II, the country would remain free of the grip of the Great Depression. Then he thought Chicago, where he'd spent a lot of time setting up the SEC offices here, at the heart of the country, in the middle of all of the transportation, with a diverse economy and strong political leadership, was a great bet. And in 1945, he bought the Merchandise Mart.
Do you happen to remember the purchase price?
I think it was around $12 million or so. Now, the Fields organization had paid about 30, and before you start crying crocodile tears for those folks, at the end of the war was really paid for by, in part, an excess profits tax. So for corporations making over a certain amount of money, I think it was around $250,000 or $500,000 a year, you had to pay 90% of that in tax to the federal government. So there was a 90% excess profits tax, and they were able to take the loss on the sale of the Merchandise Mart and really protect $20 million of income. So it worked out well for them, and it worked out well for the Kennedys.
Yeah, great. And in 2012, for those of us in the industry, certainly saw a bit of a transformation in the Mart. But then certainly the announcement of Google's Motorola Mobility had come down with 600,000 square feet, 3,000 jobs in the Mart. And let me read you something. This is from the New York Times back in September. It called the Mart a relic of an era gone by, revitalized. Does that sound right to you?
Well, I think it's, for anybody who's ever worked at the Mart, you have to love the place forevermore. And I think to see the Mart, an 80-year-old building, still so relevant to the economy of the city and to some degree the state of Illinois, I think it's an incredible transformation. Much of the Mart's basic business was aggregating companies in the same industries, really aggregating companies in the same supply chain and making it easier for retailers who are the customers to come and shop there. And that same vision of every industry, whether it's apparel, men's suits, or gift retail or furniture, was really applied to the technology industry. What's happened in Chicago is we have these, we're like dominating the high-speed trading business. And those high-speed trading firms like Getco and Ronin have moved into the apparel center, stayed downtown, didn't move to New York because they had the access to that cable. That high-speed cable can be a competitive advantage for a building, for a region of the city, and for a city itself. And if you look at what's going around the country, you know, the cities are investing in that infrastructure, and it is critically important to their future.
Yeah.
And we should be aware of that here.
Yeah, and would you say that was one of the attractive things to Shorenstein and buying the apparel center?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Shorenstein saw those companies moving in. I'm not sure they understood that relationship. I think they understand it now. I'd say our brokers, you know, John Dempsey, Bob Gillespie, they deserve some of the credit. They did not always think, you know, working with you guys was particularly easy. Some would say, Bob has this great story about how it was sort of a pain in the ass for John Dempsey. Literally, he was in a meeting and they were finalizing the AT&T deal, and it was the last little bits were being finished in June of the year. June is when we run NeoCon, which is one of the largest shows in Chicago at that time. It's probably getting 70,000 to 80,000 architects and designers. So the two sets of brokers all came over, the engineers came in, and there was no meeting space for them. So it was being used by the 300 speakers who were part of that conference. And they went into a little room and had terrible seating in it. And Dempsey got up, and there was a small table behind the conference table, and he sat on it just to get a little break from the meeting. And it turns out it was glass, and he shattered the glass. And the glass went right up his backside. It was, in fact, a pain in the ass. and Bob Gillespie tells the story. It's like a gun going off in the room. This, you know, the shattering of the glass, and Dempsey hits the floor, and he said, he looks over, and the JLL guys never take their eye off the document. after
it's that training.
There was a guy, Lampley, who worked with you guys down in Atlanta. And he looked over and he saw Dempsey on the floor. He said, "You're bleeding." And they went back to the document. He went to the hospital, and the deal got done, which is all that the market cared.
Let's shift to talk about the general metro economy. And one of the trends that you were talking about with regard to the people that looking for space in your apartment buildings, one of the trends that has occurred in the city is there's been some movement of headquarters from the suburbs downtown. United Airlines moving from Elk Grove to Willis Tower. We talked about Google Motorola Mobility. Recently, Hillshire Brands moving to the West Loop at 400 South Jefferson. And you know, it's interesting that if we're not seeing companies move their headquarters downtown, we're certainly seeing companies with offices in the suburbs put satellite offices downtown. What do you think is driving that trend, and do you think it's going to continue?
Well, you know, I think if you look just generally at the economy, there's this enormous bifurcation of, you know, very highly paid people in the top quintile, and then, you know, very poorly paid people in the bottom quintile. And much of this development is driven by trying to attract those high-end, high-income earners at the top of the economic pyramid. You know, I don't think that's great for America in general, but as it relates to Chicago, we need to be cognizant of it. And, you know, it's sort of irrelevant what their real estate costs are when they're attracting people who are being paid as much as those people generally are paid. You know, if there's a $10 a foot rent differential and an average employee occupies 225 square feet, you're talking about another $2,250 a year. When you're paying a new associate at a law firm $120,000, or you know, a new accountant at Ernst & Young, you know, those costs are irrelevant. What you want to do is attract a great candidate pool for every open slot, and those young people want to live in this city. There's no better city in America to live in when you're 22 to when you're 32. There just isn't. And those people want to be downtown in apartment buildings. The additional inventory is great for our competitive advantages.
Right. So I want to get a little bit more on the Chicago economy, but then shift to the state. But let's start with the city first. You know, what about the Chicago economic environment kind of gives you some hope, and what are some areas of concern?
Well, obviously, you know, I think it's got a great diversified, you know, we have a super diversified economy in Chicago, and it's weathered the recession pretty well. You know, from my office at the Merchandise Mart, I look out over the Mart Drive and then down the river in a couple of directions, and it's incredible. There's like, you look out there and you think there's no better city in America. And you think about the East Loop and the occupancy levels over there, and so much of that has been driven by apartment conversion from those previous office buildings and retail centers. Now apartments, people want to live near Grant Park and Millennium Park. And then you look to the west of the city, the West Loop, and see all those apartment cranes. And those cranes are really building apartments. They're building residences and not so much office buildings. When you think about the center of the loop and LaSalle Street, there's like this big dead zone, you know, where there's very low occupancy rates, and we're getting to a point where the landlords are not going to be able to afford to remortgage those buildings to pay the $60 or $70 or $80 or $90 or $100 a foot in concessions necessary to lure in tenants. And that, to me, is very scary. You know, the downtown core is being rebuilt as a, you know, as a massive residential setting, and not, you know, not driven by new jobs. And until we drive new jobs into the city, I think we're at risk of a stagnating economy and a very difficult real estate market, and more disturbing trends as well.
What role do you feel that the city should play in terms of economic incentives?
Well, I think the city needs to be aggressive, and I think it is being aggressive. But I think, you know, probably more companies have moved to Chicago and Illinois to open up in the Merchandise Mart than any other building in the state. So I think I know what it takes to get people to move here and get them to stay and expand once they arrive. And I think it's a very expensive game to try to lure those headquarters into the city from the suburbs or from around the country. We need an economic engine. You know, I personally, you know, I'm concerned because I have children. My children see their grandparents. I told you I moved here near Sheila's family. And those grandparents reinforce the lessons I want with my children. They shake, you know, they tell the kids, you need to shake a hand more firmly, look somebody in the eyes, repeat their name when they're, you know, when you're introduced to them. They reinforce those little lessons, but they also enforce more profound life lessons. It's better to win than to lose, but it's better to lose than to cheat. And it's really helpful to have somebody else telling your children those things. I want to be around to raise my grandkids. I'm not convinced that my children, when they go off to college, will return to Illinois. Are the job opportunities that exist here, the career opportunities here, as strong as they are in places like New York, or Charlotte, or London, or San Jose, or Boston, or Washington, D.C.? And that, to me, is the fundamental challenge for all of us. How do we create an economic environment that is going to lure our children back to Chicago? You go to Rush Street, State Street, 11 o'clock, it's so much fun. There's so much action. But those kids, they're from St. Louis. They're the children of people who grew up in Minneapolis. They're from families in Cleveland. You know, our kids who grow up here are going away to college because that's what kids do. They want to get away from their parents a little bit. 70% of kids who go to college get their first job in that college town. We need something to lure them back to Illinois. It has to be a thriving economy.
Well, let's take that a step further, and that is, you know, with regard to the state of our state, and you know, your thoughts in terms of what do we need to get our state fiscally on track.
Well, you know, we have declining taxable assets. We have declining taxable assets, whether that's our industrial base, which has declined tremendously, whether that's our the value of our residential real estate, which is also declining. We have declining taxable assets, and we have rising taxes. And I did not study economics. I'm not an economics major, but I can tell you that if you have declining taxable assets and rising taxes, that is a recipe for disaster. It's a toboggan run into the ground. It's just a matter of time. So somehow we need to have more taxable assets so that we can spread the tax base and lower the taxes on all the rest of us who are already here. And you know, the shocking thing for me coming to Illinois was really around the role of major universities and what role they play. I moved to Chicago from Boston. And when I was in Boston, it was sort of incredible because, you know, I went to Boston College. Everybody in the city knew Father Monin, who ran the place at the time. He would speak out on the issues of the day. He was quoted in the Boston Globe and the Boston Herald all the time. The guy who ran Harvard was a guy named Derek Bach, and most people in the city knew of that guy too. The guy who ran Boston University was a fellow named John Silver. John Silver ran for governor of Massachusetts and almost won. Billy Bulger, who was the president of the state senate there, is like the Mike Madigan of Massachusetts, left that job to become head of the University of Massachusetts. There was this incredible interplay between the heads of these universities and the political leadership and the business leadership. And the beauty of all of that was that the presidents of these universities had a leadership role, and they would tell the big donors, the fat cats in that town, give money to Tip O'Neill and to John Kerry and Ted Kennedy, and then Teddy and John and Tip would go down to Washington and they'd get federal government research grants, and they would bring them back to Boston, the major research universities like MIT, Harvard, Brandeis, or BC. That basic research would slough off applied research. The trustees and others would invest in that. They'd start little companies who would employ people, who would pay local taxes, that would fund local schools, that would educate a whole new generation ready to reinvent that economy again and again. There's this incredible divorce between the research institutions and the rest of the economy. And the fact is, MIT graduates alone have started 25,000 companies. You know, would you rather have MIT or, frankly, United Airlines downtown? I mean, that's the choice. And it's much better to have a perpetual job creation machine in these great research institutions.
Well, clearly we do not have that alignment here that you described in Boston between the academic institutions and the business community. Do you see that alignment getting closer? And in your role as chairman of the board of trustees at U of I, are you doing anything with the board to try to, you know, increase that alignment?
Yeah, there's a lot of very good things going on, but it's not just Boston. I mean, many of you are from national firms, spend some time in Pittsburgh, look at San Jose. I mean, it's incredible what's happened in those towns that have major tier 1 research universities that are integrated in the political and business life of those cities. And that's what needs to occur here. I think the new mayor has done a very good job. You know, I hope we'll have announcements this week about some of the progress we've made in a cooperative effort. I mean, you know, it's not just political infrastructure, but a lot of the charitable, you know, the foundations play an incredible role, and individuals. The Searle family that made so much money in Chicago, it's a lot of money at the Chicago Community Trust. One of them had this idea. They set aside grant money every year, about $5 million, and they said, listen, if we'll give this to U of C, Northwestern, U of I, Oregon, or Fermi. If you come up with a proposal around biotechnology, biomedicine, if you come up with a proposal and we like it, we'll give you $100,000 a year. If you come up with a proposal and you work with one of the other major research institutions, we'll give you $300 grand a year. If you do it with 3 or more institutions, we'll give you $1 million a year. And they forced those organizations to cooperate. And today, the heads of research at Fermi, Oregon, U of C, UIC, and Northwestern would meet once a quarter to discuss the, you know, basically the supply of federal government research grants, and they whack that up amongst the different groups to make sure that we're cooperating together to go after those dollars. And that can be incredible. That same group forced the state to invest $12 billion in dark fiber that linked those 6 institutions. You know, within 5 years, 10 years of that creation of $12 million fund by the state, $250 million, $250 million of research grants flowed into Illinois. And that's a great model. We're in a great place because Mayor Emanuel can control the outcome of a half a dozen congressional elections and can influence the 2 senatorial elections. He can play a great role, the governor can play a great role forcing our legislatures to go to Washington and bring home those grants. We rank 46th out of 50 states in terms of what we send to Washington in taxes and what we get back in revenue. 46 out of 50 states. That sucks. It does. If we got just to the halfway point, and being middling should not be our goal, but if we get to the halfway point, that would mean we'd have to get in something like another $30 billion a year from the federal government. The $30 billion is basically the state budget. We need another $30 billion coming in. We could clean up our rivers, rebuild our bridges, fix all our roads, rebuild the schools. And we need to align